All right, so now we get to talk about something a little bit more intersectional, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. You'll get a little bit of that from me tomorrow morning. But Dr. Sikivu Hutchinson is here to talk with us about social justice or a potential other pathways school to prison, as elucidated by some recent stories. She is a senior intergroup specialist for the Los Angeles County Human Relations Commission and founder of Women's Leadership Project, a high school feminist mentoring program. So big props for that. She's an author of Imagining Transit, Race, Gender, and Transportation Politics in Los Angeles, Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Values Wars, and Godless Americana, Race and Religious Rebels. And correct me if I'm wrong, are those available upstairs?
Yes, they are.
Wonderful. So please go upstairs and check them out when you have a chance. She is the founder of Black Skeptics of Los Angeles, and I am very happy to welcome Sikivu Hutchinson. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, and now for something completely different. For those of you Monty Python fans out there in the audience, glad to be here. High stakes test question. A female science student conducts an experiment with chemicals that explodes in a classroom. There are no injuries and there is no damage. Who gets to be the brilliant mad scientist, and who gets to be the criminal who is led away in handcuffs, expelled, charged with 2 felonies, and trotted off to juvenile hall? Bubble in A, if you are a white girl. Bubble in B, if you are a high-achieving African-American girl with no prior anything. B, as some of you may be aware, was Kiera Wilmot, a 16-year-old African-American girl who went to a Bartow, Florida school, conducted said experiment, was slapped with handcuffs, expelled, charged with 2 felonies, and carted off to juvenile hall. Wilmot's case elicited a national firestorm. She was the subject of a Color of Change petition. She got a National Science Scholarship, and the felony charges against her were eventually dropped. But most African-American girls who get suspended or expelled are not so lucky. When her case broke, there was a lot of head scratching and a lot of shock within mainstream, particularly white America, because how could such a travesty happen to a high-achieving girl in our school system? And this was coming from people that had the luxury and the privilege not to be aware of the epidemic of racial disproportionality in discipline that is defining K-12 education. African American students and other students of color, Latino students, are at the epicenter of an epidemic of suspension and expulsion and push out that's been dubbed prison pipelining. And this is something that is devastating communities of color and K-12 education. In an article that I wrote around the time of the Kiera Wilmot expulsion, I said that in many American classrooms, Black students are treated like ticking time bomb savages. They are disproportionately consigned to special ed. They are disproportionately suspended, expelled, pushed out, warehoused in juvenile detention facilities, as well as adult prisons. Black girls are suspended and expelled more than any other group besides Black boys, and this is despite the fact that national data has concluded time and again that African American students do not, in fact, offend at greater rates than other groups, but are in fact disciplined more harshly. It doesn't matter whether or not they are affluent Cosby kids, or they're in foster care or homeless. Black students are, again, the linchpin of this push out and pipelining. So for example, the main thing that African American students are disciplined and pushed out for is a category called willful defiance, which basically means you may be talking back and you may be resisting the direct order of an adult. Black student, you get bounced off campus. White student, if you get charged with willful defiance, you may get counseling, you may get therapy, you may get pushed a little Ritalin, you may get a nice sit down with your parents, if you have parents, and the dean and the principal. You might get in-house detention, where you write standards for an hour. You might get the whole range, the whole constellation of psychoanalysis about why you, Josh/Adam/Dylan, felt so aggrieved that you had to develop a small artillery to shoot up the school. And so the criminalization of Black students emerges from these diehard misperceptions that they are violent and uneducable. And these misperceptions are grounded in pop culture and mainstream media. Black women historically have never been considered anyone's weaker or fairer sex, because white women has signified the universal standard of beauty, femininity, and moral worth. And so from the Gone with the Wind era of the 1930s into the present with The Help, 2009, when Black women have appeared primarily in mainstream media, TV, and film, it's been as the slut, the hoe, the mammy, the maid, the caregiver, the sassy sidekick, or the serviceable hand-on-hip, ball-busting bitch. Rarely, if ever, the trailblazing heroine, and certainly not the good girl. And recently, we've been told that this is a new era, a new dawn, a feminist revolution of women's representations, that there are all these groundbreaking TV shows and films that spotlight trailblazing, strong heroines like Brave, an animated film of all things, Zero Dark 30, The White Fest Girls, Homeland, and of course, my personal favorite, The Hunger Games. Are any of you Hunger Games fans out there? So some of you may be aware that there was a lot of controversy that emerged when The Hunger Games came out, because lo and behold, in this coup of colorblind affirmative action casting, Jennifer Lawrence, light skin, light hair, was cast as a character that was described in the novel as having olive skin and dark hair. Secondly, a controversy emerged because there was this global pushback among some Hunger Games fans, you all may recall this, because there were so many characters of color that were playing central roles in the film. Why were these characters of color playing central roles in the film when everyone knew in the book they were white? Actually, they weren't white. And so this is a tweet on the bottom part of the PowerPoint. Why is Rue Black Sigh? That was one of the prevailing sentiments that emerged when The Hunger Games came out, pushing back against a Black girl being depicted as one of the central sympathetic characters. And so women of color, looking at this so-called feminist revolution, note that once again, the feminist revolution is televised and lily white and overexposed. Because back in the image ghetto, strong, trailblazing roles for protagonists of color, female protagonists of color, are as rare as Aunt Jemima's headscarf or Lupe Ontiveros's apron. And Lupe Ontiveros was a strong, talented Latina actress who had the dubious distinction of having played a maid 150 times. And so if white girls get to be the ass-kicking adventurers, and girls of color, ad nauseum, get to be the neo-mammy, neo-maid, neo-slut, neo-Jezebel, cheerleading on the sidelines for the white female ass kickers. What does this have to do with secularism and humanism? A few weeks ago, Black Skeptics Los Angeles hosted a discussion that spiraled into a heated debate about racial segregation in our august secular community. And one of my students, Jamion Allen, 17 years old, just graduated from Washington Prep High School, is one of our Black Skeptics First in the Family Humanist Scholarship winners, and I'll talk more about that initiative in a little bit. Jamion talked about going to predominantly white areas, white communities in LA, and being perceived as an alien invader and being stereotyped, caricatured as a ghetto girl from South Central. And it was perfectly transparent to the predominantly of color audience during this discussion why it is that there is so little participation amongst people of color in our secular organizations, in volunteering, in going to meetings, in attending confabs like this one, because lo and behold, the secular community is but a microcosm of the dominant culture. Surprise, surprise. And so, not ironically enough, the next day on our Black Skeptics blog, we got a nice little Aryan Nation Valentine from some of our fans. It went like this. The author's handle is Trayvon Skittled. The email is deadass@pickaninny.com. And for those of you millennials that don't know what a pickaninny is, it's a caricature of a black child that originated during the late 19th century. So our nice little Valentine went, of course Obama is against abortions, and especially black abortions. He's looking to expand the Democrat Party and build more jails, baby Sambos, and crackhead mamas will expand the numbers of both. So besides the painful ignorance of this person's view on Obama's choice policies, this kind of sentiment is not an anomaly. It's not something that's confined to the Paula Deans and the Tea Party internet. And this was, again, not ironically, the day of the trial of George Zimmerman, the watch commander who is charged with murdering 17-year-old Trayvon Martin and having skipped out under the protection of Florida's Stand Your Ground laws. This kind of sentiment was expressed ad nauseum during the 2012 presidential campaign with Christian fascist demagogues like Newt Gingrich evoking neo-welfare queen propaganda and claiming that really poor children living in really poor neighborhoods had no values of hard work, had no ethics for rugged individualism, knew nothing about bootstrapping. And it was very transparent to people of color when this propaganda was trotted out that the really poor children that Gingrich was assailing were not coming from the Honey Boo Boo reality TV universe. The really poor children that he was assailing were coming from the social construction of the racial other, because everyone knows that poor white people are victims of circumstance, of downsizing, of hard knocks, of unfair, unjust affirmative action policies that benefit lazy, shiftless, pathological black folk by giving them the jobs of hardworking Americans. And so if we are talking about culturally relevant teaching, culturally relevant humanist teaching, there must be engagement with breaking down how these images and ideologies shape economic disparities in wealth, in job access, and in education. Because youth of color in the United States have the most staggeringly high unemployment rates, and Black women are not far behind. And when mainstream white America thinks about racism, it thinks knuckle-dragging, Confederate flag-waving rednecks, rather than the complexities of institutional racism and class power structures, and how they absolutely advantage whites across all class backgrounds. And so when we have this kind of blindness and deflection when it comes to the depth and intractability of white supremacy and institutional racism, you get in the secular community a kind of atheist exceptionalism. So an atheist exceptionalism exemplified by crazy shit where you have American atheists slapping up a billboard with a shackled, naked slave in a predominantly of color community in an era and in a nation that is the most prolific jailer of African Americans. You get reductive shit like new atheists claiming that the antidote to the problems of the hyper-religious, backward, primitive folk living in the so-called ghetto, Blacks and browns, the antidote is Darwin Day and Origin of the Species. And so in my book, Gallus Americana, I say, this kind of ahistorical paternalistic ignorance is one of the reasons why the face of new atheism is still white and racially segregated. Organized religion is dominant in communities of color because urban retail and commercial development is moribund, green space is at a minimum, and many schools have been turned into fortresses. But most secular organizations don't give a damn about the realities of urban communities of color in the US. White folks from all walks of life have the luxury of not really seeing the segregated Black neighborhoods they bypass on the freeway. White atheist elites are not steeped in regimes of mass incarceration, educational apartheid, and residential segregation. They don't have to be aware that these regimes give them the freedom to get tenured STEM jobs, publish books, and travel the world proselytizing about secularism and its glories. They don't have to be on the front lines pushing for universal preschool or college prep as a civil secular right. Their children don't have to go to the so-called hellhole inner city schools depicted in charter school propaganda horror films like Waiting for Superman. And they certainly don't have to view economic justice as anything other than a buzz phrase. So earlier this year, Black Skeptics Los Angeles initiated a first in the family humanist scholarship fund. And this fund and program was designed to target specifically undocumented, homeless, foster care, and LGBTQ young people, because these are the young people that face the steepest barriers in the so-called exceptionalist, colorblind meritocracy to going to college. Foster care young people and homeless young people in particular have abysmal college-going rates, college preparation, college retention, and college graduation. In LA County, African American youth comprise 30% of the foster care population and over 50% of the homeless youth population. The homeless youth population is comprised of about 30% of youth that identify as LGBTQ, and where do these youth go when they are systematically dispossessed from their homes? Where do they go for reinforcement, for resourcing, for visibility? Many of them of color go to faith-based institutions. They go to faith-based institutions because there absolutely are no secular humanist organizations in our communities because of the intersection of capitalist disenfranchisement, racial apartheid, and institutional inequities. And so the issue is that we, as African American atheists, are the only group in the nation that are frontally addressing this epidemic and this obscenity of prison pipelining by developing an initiative that focuses on college pipelining and frames it within the nexus of anti-racism, social justice, and humanism. This year, we had an extremely outstanding crop of applicants. They were coming from schools that had less than 50% graduation rates to schools that had 90% four-year college-going rates. And this particular school that had a 90% four-year college-going rate is in Compton. I heard Compton maligned earlier this evening. This school is a predominantly African-American and Latino school, exemplary, with scholars that are going to prestigious four-year colleges and universities, contrary to the mainstream stereotype. And so I'd like to introduce and conclude with some of our outstanding scholars. Philip Aubrey, who is a foster care young person and an activist and a mentor of other foster care young men, going to Babson College, first in his family to go to college, virtually homeless, coming from King Drew Medical Magnet, the exemplary school in Compton, predominantly black and brown. And when he responded to the question about the interface of humanism and social justice, he talked about wanting to redress this issue of mass incarceration in his community, having seen so many talented, brilliant, intellectual African-American, Latino young men be pipelined into prison. Hugo Cervantes, who is an undocumented youth, identifies as gay, talks about this intersection between the activism and the organizing of the Freedom Riders, making that connection between the Freedom Riders dealing with bedrock racial apartheid and the ways in which young people who are involved in the Dreamer movement, the undocumented youth movement, are connecting to that legacy. Because there is no National Dream Act, undocumented youth face an extremely steep barrier to going to college, staying in college, and graduating from college. Victory Yates, who is one of my Women's Leadership Project students, is an activist for women's rights in her community, talks about the normalization of violence against young women of color, wants to be a legal advocate and an advocate for foster care youth because she is a former foster care youth herself, coming from an extremely restrictive, draconian religious environment. And last but not least, Jamion Allen, who is one of our most outstanding, most activist speakers. She is a straight ally, works with our Gay Straight Alliance, is Women's Leadership Project activist, first in her family to go to college. Is also a winner of one of the Youth LA County Volunteer of the Year awards. And so if you are interested in finding out more about the work that Black Skeptics, Women's Leadership Project, and our First in the Family initiative does, this is our website here. We got a lot of support from the secular community. This was the first time that we went to the secular community. We got really generous help from organizations like the American Humanist Association, Foundation Beyond Belief, Black Nonbelievers of Chicago, individuals and organizations across the globe. A really phenomenal showing. And really, the bottom line here is that if secular organizations are serious about trying to establish some type of grassroots traction within communities of color, it has to be on the level of cultural relevance and cultural responsiveness. The lived experiences, the cultural capital, the community context, and the realities that confront youth of color in particular in this paradoxical situation where they are constantly being told that there's every opportunity, we're the font of exceptionalism, post-racialism, and colorblindness. And they look around their communities and see that that is an absolute travesty. So in closing, If you have not gotten Godless, it's upstairs. It is my latest book, Godless Americana, Race and Religious Rebels. Talks a lot about these issues from the social justice activist, progressive, radical, humanist standpoint. And also highlights a lot of the stories, narratives, and struggles of young people of color in South LA. My first book, Moral Combat, is also available. And to conclude, I want to go back because I forgot to get Jamie on quote. Jamion says, in my experience doing peer education workshops, I often find that the homophobic views of young men of color are rooted in religious homophobic speech, as well as the image that society sets that says it is wrong to be gay. I have come to believe that what is actually wrong is the acceptance of racist, sexist, and homophobic depictions of ourselves. Humanism means freedom from the layers of lies we've been told to believe. Amen to that. Thank you.